Our top stories this evening. Employment in Singapore has seen its largest quarterly drop on record. The decline was sharpest in the services sector, including F&B and retailers. Overall, the unemployment rate rose to almost 3% in June, the highest in more than a decade. More help for mid-career job seekers. Over 13,000 company attachments are now available under a new program by Workforce Singapore and the Singapore Business Federation. For a closer look at how things are going on the jobs front, we're joined by Associate Professor Walter Theseira from the Singapore University of Social Sciences. Good evening, Professor. So retrenchment and unemployment up sharply in Q2. How does this compare with your expectations?
Well, first, I think the numbers are, of course, very concerning. If you've been directly affected, it'll be a huge setback. But the numbers are in line with, they're actually better than what has happened in some other major economies so far. So, for example, unemployment in the United States actually peaked at close to 15%, 15% in April this year. The Singapore economy has actually shed about 4% of all jobs in the first half of the year. But because most of the job losses have been borne by foreign workers, the effect has actually been less severe on local workers. We've seen that resident unemployment has only risen by about 0.5% to just under 4%. So it's objectively somewhat better than some other economies thus far.
And what does it show about then the effectiveness of government measures?
Well, I think the fact that we've been able to keep job losses for locals somewhat under control thus far, that's because of the huge amount of cash support that we've given to employers to subsidize wages under the job support scheme. There's been a similar job support scheme in the United Kingdom. Unemployment there has also been kept quite stable throughout COVID-19. Now, in contrast, in the United States, much of the COVID-19 support was actually given in enhanced unemployment benefits instead. And because of that, employers there had much less reason to keep workers on, and that's why you saw unemployment numbers really go up there much faster than in some other places.
So the success of the job support measures notwithstanding, there are warnings that things could get worse in the second half of this year. How bad could it possibly get, Professor Theseira?
Well, this is really a problem of insufficient demand and revenue to pay for the current levels of employment that a lot of firms in Singapore have. Our businesses, they have a cost structure and they have employment levels that are based on the kind of demand that they saw in 2019. But they're seeing a huge drop in demand, and that requires adapting your cost structure, your employment level. Otherwise, you can't survive. I mean, the airline industry is the best example. They've got aircraft pilots, cabin crew to carry the number of passengers that they had in 2019. And we know, so far that the level of demand for air passenger travel is, something like only in the single-digit percentages compared to what it was in 2019. So it's not possible to cover all of those costs with the level of demand they're likely to get for the rest of the year. And, I think it's really hard to say how much worse it's going to get right now, but these are the reasons why we can expect some more, I think, restructuring and adjustments to unemployment, to employment in the months ahead.
And with that in mind, then, what can be done to mitigate the impact of this?
I think at some point, we're going to have to pivot our strategy. We are already doing that, but we'll have to pivot even more away from just retaining jobs to instead supporting workers and businesses to restructure. Because right now, with the job support scheme, we've been spending a lot of public money to keep workers and businesses the way they are, right? To keep the level of employment at 2019 levels. And that makes sense if you are sure that demand is going to recover sharply. And I think we used to believe that demand would recover quite sharply. Maybe about 4 to 5 months ago, we thought that was going to be the case. But unfortunately, it's looking very challenging right now with reports of a second wave or continuing waves of infections in many major markets. It does not look like we will actually have a very sharp recovery in the next couple of months.
One measure to address these job losses is the creation of jobs, and the National Jobs Council has a very specific goal of creating many new jobs. So what do these latest job figures say to you about the challenges that now confront the National Jobs Council, and what should it be doing going forward?
You know, as noted earlier, a lot of our job losses have been concentrated among foreign workers. They will have returned to their home country. So we do not actually have to replace all of the jobs that have been lost, because many of them are not local jobs that have been lost. But local unemployment nonetheless has risen. We have well over 100,000 locals unemployed right now. There are also going to be fresh graduates and maybe people coming from outside of the labor force looking for a job to help support their families' living expenses. So I think right now the National Jobs Council is off to a good start, because we've heard there's encouraging demand by firms for traineeships and other positions. But what's going to be critical is to ensure that the jobs created actually build skills for workers and build capabilities for companies. Because creating jobs isn't actually the problem. There's an old joke among economists, if you want to create jobs, pay half the people to dig holes in the ground, pay the other half to fill up the holes again. So the point is, creating jobs that add economic value is actually a really tricky thing. There's a danger with these government subsidies that some jobs created will just not be economically sustainable. So I think it's very much up to working with individual firms in order to create jobs which are sustainable, which lead to skills development and capabilities for the firms.
The labour movement has revealed its concerns about how retrenchments at Eagle Services Asia were handled as one specific case. How will the job situation make it more challenging as laid-off workers try to get a fair deal?
Well, first, I think we have to differentiate between retrenchments at firms which are still going concerns and job losses from firms which have to shut down completely. Now, in the former case, that's actually what happened at Eagle Services. That also describes what happened at Resorts World. These are firms which are still going concerns. They have an interest in maintaining a good reputation as a responsible employer. And because they're still in business, they have the financial resources to treat retrenched workers better. And I think these firms have to be held to a high standard by the unions and by the government. The retrenched workers there are basically sacrificing their jobs to keep other workers employed and to keep their firms a going concern. The retrenched workers must be respected for that. But if a firm actually becomes insolvent, that's a very serious issue, because wages and retrenchment benefits become part of the claims that creditors have against the firm. You can come to an agreement, with an insolvent firm, but if it cannot be enforced, if the benefits aren't paid, it's also no use. So I think, as counterproductive as it may sound, it's more responsible for firms who are in a really difficult situation to think about whether they can exit or restructure gracefully, paying their obligations to workers, and for unions and government to work with firms to do that. What we don't actually want is for firms to hang on until the end and then to leave workers with unpaid wages and no retrenchment benefits. So it's going to be a tricky situation going forward.
Certainly is. Thank you for sharing your insight with us this evening, though. Associate Professor Walter Theseira from the Singapore University of Social Sciences.